A very good afternoon to you and welcome to this special broadcast of the National Budget Speech, as will be tabled by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni in just a few minutes. My name is Zugelwa Solomon, your host for this event, and in just a few minutes, I'll introduce you to our panel of experts who will all make sense, not only from a general economic context, but also from a personal context. And of course, we will be doing that just shortly. But before we get into that, let me remind you that our conversations are never quite complete without your participation. And therefore, we invite you to send us your questions using the functionality on your screen. But remember, your questions will only be answered towards the latter part of our discussion when the Minister has already tabled that national budget speech at 2 p.m. Now, let me introduce you to Tina Plain, who is the Managing Executive for Absa Private Wealth and Business Banking. Tina, thank you so much and welcome. Tina?
Good afternoon, everyone, and hello to everyone on the line.
Thank you so much, Tina, for having joined us. And now at the core of Absa's value proposition is customer centricity, always putting the customer front and center of what we do. Give us your insights in terms of why it was important for us to be having this discussion on the back of the national budget speech.
Thanks, Zuki. Yes, our valuable clients and stakeholders who've joined us today know that we are always trying to find engaging platforms for stimulating debate. And we hope that today's session is another such example. So on behalf of Absa, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all our guests, panelists and colleagues at our annual Absa Agribusiness Budget Session. We know that this year's budget is likely to be one of the most challenging ones in decades due to the persistent economic pressures and the negative multiplier of COVID-19. So today we'll be introducing an impressive lineup of panelists, and they'll share their insights on what the budget may bring. We'll be focusing on key themes that are underpinned by the realities that played out last year and early this year. Firstly, there's the financial environment. The liquidity crisis at the Land Bank has severely impacted a key enabler of agriculture. And within the financial services in the arena, we all have a very big role to play to broaden the base of commercial farmers. And it's in our interest to see the Land Bank succeed. So in the medium-term budget, Minister Mboweni announced a 7 billion rand allocation to the Land Bank over the next 3 years. And the key outcome of today's speech will be an indication of the timelines associated with this allocation, as this will affect the broader investment climate into agriculture. A second theme is the drafting of the agricultural master plans. These created a joint vision of stakeholders in various subsectors, and is a social compact between producers, processors, labour and government providers. So it provides a framework to overcome the strategic challenges facing agricultural subsectors. The poultry master plan has been signed off, and currently the agro-processing plan is being developed. So we look forward to seeing how the budget will enable the implementation of these plans. And then on to producer issues. Despite the strong performance of agriculture during 2020, the industry is facing mounting costs, and these will place pressure on margins. They include an increase in the minimum wage, an electricity tariff hike of 15%, and rising oil prices that will see a rise on farm and processing input costs. And we hope that there are announcements in the budget that provide relief to farmers. And then the final theme, importantly, today is the environment. Despite the good rains recently, a drought in certain regions of the Southern Cape and Karoo is a very stark reminder that environmental factors are a key determinant of business feasibility and financial success in agriculture. So collaboration and debate is very important, as climate is a theme that will require ongoing focus. So we look forward, as I said, to unpacking these themes with you, our very valuable clients and industry stakeholders. And we hope that you will find it an engaging and stimulating platform, and that this debate will prove to you our support of the sectors in which you operate. And so from me, we wish you well and value you making time to consider these important issues as we focus on the reconstruction and reshaping of a more prosperous economy. Thank you. Back to you, Zuki.
Thank you so much, Tina, for your insights in this particular discussion, and of course emphasizing the importance of that public-private partnership in ensuring that our customers are serviced well. Now, let me introduce you to our panel of experts who will be making sense of the budget when we get it. That is at 2 p.m. Starting off with Ricardo Smith, who is the head of investment strategy at Absa Global Investment Solution. Ricardo, thank you so much for your time and welcome.
Hi, Zuki. Thanks indeed for this platform and panel. I'm looking forward to seeing what the budget has in store, in particular, having a look at how the fiscal deficit has changed. We do know, of course, that it widened quite aggressively last year off the back of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, higher than expected tax revenue. Looking to see what level of tax revenue government has been able to raise and how they plan on spending that tax revenue between much needed fiscal consolidation, debt repayment, as well as the much needed vaccine procurement and rollout procedure, and how the government sees economic growth going forward. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. We also have on our panel Thabi Ngozi, who is managing partner at African Green Alpha Private Equity. Thabi, always a great pleasure to speak to you and welcome to you too.
Hi, Zuki, and good afternoon, everyone. Zuki, I think today is going to be a difficult budget. There's a lot to achieve with very little resources. Today, I'm expecting to see a lot of creativity from the National Treasury and a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. And the good news is that we had already started to see some of this play out last year, where we saw quite a bit of fancy footwork from the Treasury in dealing with the pandemic, where they had tried to pursue counter-cyclical measures, but also being constrained by a dwindling public purse. So no doubt today, a lot of people will be looking to see whether the finance minister has any more tricks in his bag and looking for some much needed reprieve. In terms of what I'll specifically be looking out for, I want to see whether there is coherence in terms of what the president had announced in his State of the Nation address and the finance minister's funding for the priorities that were announced. Of course, one of those priorities was strengthening the public health system and, getting an efficient vaccine rollout program. And unfortunately, last year we had seen instances where there seemed to be a lack of alignment between the Treasury and the Department of Health, which led to some delays in the procurement of vaccines. So I'm expecting the minister to really highlight to us how we're going to improve the efficiency on this. And again, as Tina mentioned, the land bank is a big concern for the agricultural sector. Investors often use the land bank and its health as a proxy for what is happening in the general investment environment. So its implications run far beyond the entity itself and have large implications for agribusinesses that administer their loans to the emerging farmers that rely solely on it. So absolutely, that is one of their priorities that I think the finance ministers should have. Thanks, Zuki. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Thabi. And of course, at this time last year, a lot of us were not aware that the land bank would be an additional expenditure item on in as far as those bailouts are concerned. Now, let me cross over to Christoph van der Riede, who is the Executive Director of Agri SA, for his thoughts on today's speech.
Good afternoon. We've seen last year that the Minister of Finance, during his medium-term budget speech, has decreased some of the monies that were supposed to go to the Department of Agriculture. And that had quite an impact on land reform initiatives and also other services provided by that. So first and foremost, it would be very interesting to see what kind of money he will allocate this time around to those departments. And remember now, Department of Land Affairs and Department of Agriculture is now one department. And it's critical for us to understand what type of money will be invested in that one department now, and secondly, how will that money be spent? There's a big talk about expectations around land reform. My big question is always, if you don't have the money, what are you going to do? Because now you've raised certain expectations. Remember, government has also made 700,000 hectares of land available. Obviously, it's not the job of the Minister of Finance to tell us how far they are with that process. But we want to know what kind of money will be invested. Because it's one thing to give people land, but people need money to obviously unlock the production potential of that land. And then secondly, what kind of money will be spent on infrastructure? We've seen last year a lot of, the agriculture sector has done well because government has opened up harbors. We've remained very competitive in terms of our exports, but we want to see real-time investment in terms of harbor development, road infrastructure development, also investment in electricity, and as Thabe has mentioned, money into the land bank.
Most certainly. Now, Professor Ferdi Meyer, who is the Managing Director of the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, I'm sure you agree with a lot of the sentiment that has been put forward by the rest of the panelists.
No, absolutely, Zuki, and thanks very much for this opportunity. I think what I want to add is the importance around the key message. What are we going to get? What's the overarching message that we're going to get from this budget? And is this a message of sending out a signal for investment? And you know, we all understand our limits and our constraints. Budgets are extremely under pressure. Economy is growing very slow. The space for increasing taxes is limited, especially in an economy that is not expanding. The amount of funding that's available to inject into the economy is limited. So this coherence, I think Thabe, you've referred to that, the coherence or the linkage of this to our SONA and to the overall vision. How does this all integrate? Because at the end of the day, we'll really need this alignment. We'll need to tell not only a story, but have a concrete plan for investments to flow. And these are not only investments to drive growth, but also investments to, these are all like labor absorbing investments. And that's a challenge. In agriculture, we saw those numbers coming out yesterday. We had a very good year due to good weather conditions, mainly good prices, slightly weak exchange rate, good crops, but we actually shed jobs. And yes, there was a big pressure on the wine industry, which is a very labor intensive industry, and the limitations of movement of people. But generally, the concern is, you know, we have investments and there are profits, but how sustainable are these, and can we absorb labor also and have inclusive growth coming? And that's why this key overarching message of this is an investment that I want, this is an environment that I can invest in, and it's a secure investment, and you have an integrated model where you have careful and prioritized investment across the value chain. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights, Professor Meyer. Now, rounding off panels, or rather panelists, is Simon Gia, who is no stranger to broadcasting. Simon is also a writer as well as an environmental scientist. Now, Simon, you've heard what everyone has had to say about the tough fiscal position that the government finds itself in, and how, as Thabe touched on, how we're going to need to see some sort of coherency in what the government, in the form of the president, said in the State of the Nation address, and what the minister will say in just a few minutes. Now, coming in from the green economy type of background, what are you looking forward to from today?
I mean, you're quite right. It's been a nightmare year, not only for South Africa but for the whole world. And I suspect that a lot of decision makers are saying, well, when your house is on fire, you don't worry about fixing the roof necessarily. And environmental legislation tends to be more long-term thinking. Tends to be, have a horizon sometimes of a generation. Whereas a lot of what is currently wrong is very, very immediate and short term. In terms of where I would like to see money being spent, Well, yes, we obviously need to be improving our energy network, and a large part of that is making that network more renewable, or at least spending more money on renewables. Doesn't really improve our environmental footprint overall, because of course what we're doing is adding extra capacity to our existing network, not necessarily taking existing fossil fuel production offline and replacing it with renewables, rather adding renewables to the network. So that, I'm afraid, doesn't really qualify for me as a greening of the economy, but it is very, very important that we do spend money on things like wind and on solar and on embedded generation, which is a small scale generation where you have perhaps solar panels on top of a factory roof that are then fed back into the system. That sort of energy mix is very, very important. And even if it doesn't mean an overall greening of our economy right now, what it does do is improve capacity, improve institutional knowledge of how to build these sort of projects, so that when we find ourselves maybe in calmer waters, then we can really start working towards improving our overall energy mix. In terms of just general environmental thought and knowledge, I really do hope that we don't see opportunities for companies to shortcut environmental legislation in an effort to kickstart growth. That's often a massive temptation in times like these, and yet all you're really doing there is kicking problems down the road for future generations to deal with.
Thank you so much, Simon, for your views on this particular topic. And now to you, our viewers, please make sure that you take part in this discussion by using the functionality on your screen as already stated. You might also want to create a username on the right-hand side of the video so that you can join this discussion. Now, Ricardo, let me come to you, and as we drill deeper into this discussion, and ask you, in terms of the structural constraints that are needed to boost the economy rather, and of course ensure that we are growing at full economic potential, what do you think the minister needs to touch on today?
For sure, thanks for that. I think some of the panelists have touched on some of these issues. When you look at potential GDP, there's really three main factors that you need to control, which is capital, labor, and technology. Now, from a capital perspective, looking at government's budget, we need a higher allocation towards economic development initiatives. Currently, economic development only gets about 10% of government's expenditure, and in excess of 30% of the expenditure goes towards the wage bill. So containing the wage bill will be key. Whether there's political will to do that, particularly with local elections coming up in the year, will remain to be seen. Also attracting foreign direct investment, as well as public-private partnerships from a funding perspective to grow that gross fixed capital formation element of capital. Then from a labor perspective, Prof. Meyer mentioned labor absorbing initiatives. Because you look at economic growth over the last couple of years, the fastest growing sector has been the finance sector, which is not predominantly known for being very labor absorbent. And some of the slowest growing sectors have been, including agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, etc. So you need to invest in those labor absorbing initiatives, invest in long-term education, both formal and informal, so that you can cut that structural unemployment level. From a technology perspective, two things that really stand out. The first, Simon touched on a bit when he spoke about, the energy space, renewable energy. We don't have a reliable, sustainable electricity supply. That definitely needs to be fixed. One of the more recent contentious elements has been the release of spectrum, which should enable the economy to access more efficient and faster, potentially cheaper data, particularly looking at the economy of the future. And those are some of the key initiatives to close the current negative output gap.
And Tabi, moving on to you, yesterday we saw the labor unemployment figures coming out, sitting at record highs. Now, the agricultural sector is one that has the potential to absorb a lot of the unskilled labor and therefore putting a dent on that high unemployment figure. And as we saw last year from a quarterly growth perspective anyway, the agricultural sector showing signs of resilience, growing quarter on quarter in spite of the coronavirus pandemic. What do you think the government needs to do going forward to ensure that this growth in the sector is sustained?
Yeah, Zuki, you're quite correct. And the president also highlighted the sector's positive performance in his SONA as well. But essentially what we need to ensure is that this positive performance can continue by providing the correct environment for that to happen. So for instance, if we don't deal with the funding issue, particularly as we go into the next production season, we really put the production, particularly of summer grain producers, at risk. So that might affect performance somewhat. The other thing that the sector relies on to a great extent is economic growth, because ultimately the sector produces what people consume. So the more people are able to put in their pockets to consume agricultural goods, the better for the sector. And of course, the president has been talking about the introduction of economic reforms to boost this growth. But so far, we have yet to see any coherent policy documents or anything tangible that allows us to see what the government is thinking in terms of economic growth. So I'm really hoping that the minister will provide that type of clarity, not just to the agricultural sector, but I think investors and consumers at large.
Thank you so much, Tabi. Now, Christo, moving on to you. We do have just under 8 minutes before the minister takes to the podium. Just briefly, in terms of what Tabi also touched on, this being the funding or lack thereof for the agricultural sector, what is it that you think the minister needs to do more to support the sector from a producer perspective?
We've seen tremendous growth in certain sectors, also growth in exports. So I think investment in unlocking of markets, because it's one thing to grow products, but if you don't have a market, then you run into troubles. So with markets goes infrastructure. So that's one critical aspect for us. And then secondly, we need to boost the capacity of certain key agricultural departments. We know that certain biological hazards have a negative impact on productivity. We've seen our outbreak of locusts, outbreak of all kinds of other diseases. And we've got serious problems with the registration of biological control products and chemical products in terms of Act 36 of 1947. That office is not living up to the expectations. Sometimes we have to wait 2 to 3 years for products, biological products, to be registered and approved. And that is a very, very serious risk for the agricultural sector, because any of these things can wipe out agricultural products in no time. So I think there's key areas that the minister have to focus on and have to fund.
Thank you so much, Christo. Now, moving on to you, Professor Meyer. Now, you are of the view that the future of the South African agricultural sector depends on government and industry making the right policy as well as investment choices. Briefly, take us through these choices.
I'll be very quick and just quickly add to what colleagues have already mentioned. So I think the real focus here is thinking about integrated value chains. First of all, if we're thinking about partnerships between government and private sector, we need to think at the full value chain. So we need a very close coherence and working not only between private sector and government, but also between government departments. Very practically, DTIC, agriculture and water. There needs to be very close collaboration and trade and industry. Then secondly, idle resources. Let's focus on those. We have water, we have land that's lying idle. We need to unlock it. And then thirdly, support and innovation and markets. So we have potential for opening of markets. They are there. We understand how to do it. There needs to be capacity for it to be done. So that's the short message.
Thank you, Professor. Now, Simon, rounding off with you before we cross to the minister. Now, tax is always an issue that is very controversial when it comes to the South African context anyway, given how tight our environment, not tight rather, but how constrained our growth environment is. Now, in 2019, when the government introduced the carbon tax, it targeted a 34% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that was in the short to medium term, and a 42% reduction in the medium to long term. Are we making any progress on this? Simon, your mic is off. Apologies for that. We seem to be having a problem getting Simon's response in this regard. Simon, may you please turn your mic on? Okay, Ricardo, let me come back to you while we wait for Simon to join us again. In terms of South Africa's output gap, how is this likely to be reduced using the might of the policy, or rather, how is the South Africa's output gap likely to be addressed using what is available for the government to address the economic constraints that we find ourselves in?
For sure. I think, some of the issues at hand, government is well aware of. The first thing is they need to constrain their expenditure. The biggest problem remains a political will around some of these issues. How well government is able to narrow the current deficit. We are currently in what is a bit of a debt trap, and there's three ways essentially to get out of that. You either raise taxes, to your earlier question around taxes, you cut your expenditure, or you raise GDP. When you look at the increase in taxes, there isn't appetite for that from a consumer perspective. You're sitting with a distressed consumer whose debt to disposable income ratio is in excess of 70%, unemployment rate above 30%. You've had multiple tax hikes, but they haven't really garnered the level of tax revenue that government was hoping for. And so you really start to make those tough decisions around wage freezes and around fixing some of your state-owned enterprises, which provide quite a lot of leakages in the system. As Prof. May also mentioned, you need some coherence between not only the public and the private sector, but within the public sector itself. Quite a lot of plans have been put forward. Quite a lot of economic reform plans have been put forward, but the goal and the target seems to be pushed further and further out. We were, as South Africa, planning to stabilize our debt, for instance, at a level below 60% debt to GDP, and it always seems to be in the next 2 to 3 years. And that 2 to 3 years has been a bit of a rolling period as opposed to a fixed point. The last time we saw that debt has deteriorated to levels above that level, and now government is hoping to stabilize it around 95% debt to GDP. So some tough decisions really need to be made from a fiscal perspective and from a capital allocation perspective. And we need real GDP to be at least a level of 2% for government to start containing their debt, in particular looking at where their cost of debt is way above that 2% level.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Tabby, just one last one before we cross over live to Parliament for today's national budget speech. And we're going back to the Land Bank. How do you expect the Finance Minister to address some of the liquidity constraints at the bank?
We certainly expect him to tell us when that 7 billion rands will flow. Has it flowed already? What are the arrangements around that? Are there any operational conditions that he had set for that? Are there any restructuring plans? So certainly we need all of that detail. Whether it will come through in today's speech or in a subsequent address by the Minister of Agriculture is to be seen. But certainly we're really keeping our fingers crossed for some more detail in terms of when this will happen.
Thank you everyone for your insights in this particular regard. It is 2 p.m. on the dot, and in just a few minutes, the minister will take it to the podium, if he hasn't already, to address us in terms of what they plan to do to ensure fiscal sustainability, to ensure that we get value for money, and as far as our balance of payments is in light of the depressed economic conditions, increased expenditure needs that now include the Land Bank and other state-owned enterprises, as is always the case. All of this is happening at a time when South Africa's revenue sources are strained. Now, let me see if we have the minister already joining us to ensure that you do take part, or rather you do not miss out on any of what he has to say in this regard. Remember, we will reconvene right back here, where we will make sense of whatever pronouncements the minister makes, and this we will do with our panel of experts. Also continue to send us your questions, and these they will answer towards the latter part of our discussion.
against COVID-19. We also salute the many South Africans who rallied to help others to survive. I must include amongst the frontline workers that we normally forget, these are the military medical services. These acts of human solidarity and sacrifice reflect a patriotic spirit that runs in our veins and inspires us. The president would have said, this is in our DNA. Much better English, I suppose. Often we speak about how we must leave this earth much better than what we found, so that the future generations can enjoy a better world. Today, I want to leave all of us hopeful and outline how we will leave this economy in a better shape for those who come after us. Under the leadership of our president, we have crafted a fiscal framework that extends support to the economy and public health services in the short term, while ensuring the sustainability of our public finances in the medium term. This is our first reason for hope. The fiscal framework we table today entails the following. The main budget revenue is projected to be 1.35 trillion rand, or 25.3% as a share of gross domestic product in 2021. This rises to 1.52 trillion rand in the outer year being 2023-24 of the medium-term expenditure framework. When we were writing these numbers, Mr. President, 1.52 trillion, I was tempted to ask one member of the House how many zeros are in a trillion, but I thought not to do that. At the same time, non-interest spending will remain steady at approximately 1.56 trillion rand over the next 3 years, but will decline as a share of GDP from 29.2% in 2021-22 to 26.2% of GDP in 23-24. I requested tips from the public to help in crafting this budget. Many tips spoke about the limits to increased taxation. Others spoke about the need to cut the number of cabinet ministers, and I told them that was above my pay cut. It's above my pay level. That's not mine. We agree that tax increases must be kept to a minimum. And therefore, General Khwebane, there's no need for a tax revolt. We have chosen not to introduce the 40 billion rand in tax measures initially proposed in the October medium-term budget policy statement. I'll explain why later. With this framework, we provide the budget for South Africa's vaccination campaign. This campaign allows us to emerge from the restrictions that we have experienced to economic activity. So the restrictions were meant to help us fight against COVID. And now, as we gradually fight this, introducing vaccines, we should be able to return in time to full economic activity. We are allocating more than 10 billion rand for the purchase and delivery of vaccines over the next 2 years. But we do not stop there. We are increasing the contingency reserve from 5 billion to 12 billion to make provision for any further purchases of vaccines and to cater for any other emergencies. With this framework, we are on track to achieve our goal of closing the main budget primary deficits. We shall achieve a primary surplus on the main budget in 2024-25. This will be an important achievement and will coincide with the end of this sixth parliament. Most importantly, we will stabilize government debt at 88.9% of GDP in 2025-26, and the ratio will decline further thereafter. This is a significant commitment and improvement to the framework as compared to what we presented in October last year, and creates a sound platform for sustainable growth. I thought you would clap because it says this is a significant improvement to the framework that we presented in October last year and creates a sound platform for sustainable growth. Total consolidated spending amounts to 2 trillion rand each year over the medium term, the majority of which goes to social services, about 56%. So when people talk about austerity this, austerity that, you can't. It's not supported by empirical evidence. Honorable members, getting our fiscal house in order is the biggest contribution we can make to support our economic reconstruction and recovery plan. Continuing on the path of fiscal consolidation during these economic times was a difficult decision. But we're here precisely because we want to make difficult decisions. If you want to make easy decisions, go swimming. However, on this, we are resolute. We remain adamant that fiscal prudence is the best way forward. We cannot allow our economy to have feet of clay. High government debt levels increase the cost of borrowing across the economy. The rising debt levels lead to higher future taxation and uncertainty. Servicing this rising debt takes away resources that could have been invested in infrastructure and frays our social solidarity. Madam Speaker, yes. Sometimes it's the Deputy Speaker. It reminds me when the Honorable Sisulu was the Speaker, and after Honorable Freni Jingwala, and somebody referred to Honorable Sisulu as Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, my second reason for hope stems from our much improved economic outlook. Global economic growth is expected to rebound to 5.5% in 2021, before moderating slightly to 4.2% in 2022, spurred on by the expected rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines throughout the world and other additional policy measures, deliberate economic policy measures. China is expected to grow at 8.1% in 2021, while India will achieve a growth rate of 11.5% in 2021. Sub-Saharan Africa is forecast to grow by 3.2%. In this context, Mr. President, the South African economy is expected to rebound by 3.3% this year, following a 7.2% contraction in 2020, and average around 1.9% in the outer 2 years. Madam Speaker, honorable members, I am also hopeful because we are making meaningful progress in the implementation of our structural reform program. Our structural weaknesses limit the rate at which our economy can grow. Our structural reform agenda as articulated in the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, is aimed at removing these brakes on economic growth. Operation Vulindlela, which I introduced to you last year, has already made demonstrable progress in accelerating the pace of implementation of high-impact structural reforms. More often than not, we're very hard on ourselves, and we say we make decisions that we never implement. This is not the case here. We are implementing. Much of this progress was outlined in the State of the Nation address by our President. I want to thank my cabinet colleagues for their support of Operation Vulindlela. And I assure members that Deputy Minister Dr. David Masondo and the team from the Presidency and the National Treasury remain hard at work together with the relevant departments to ensure the continued implementation of the remaining reforms as outlined. We will not rest until we have fundamentally altered the structure of this economy by lowering barriers to entry, broadening ownership patterns, which some people don't want to talk about, raising productivity, and lowering the cost of doing business. Honorable members, we face many challenges as a developing country. We are confronting these challenges head-on. Our country has a network of highways and byways, which are the envy of many around the world. The mighty N1 that starts just here in Cape Town to Beitbridge, the scenic R71 that meanders through the misty mountains of Makgobaskloof and delivers us to the Kruger National Park, and the expansive N4 that stretches from Botswana across our country into Mozambique. They are part of the lifeblood of the regional economy. Our great dams, bridges, and railway lines have supported our economy for decades. However, much of this infrastructure now needs to be repaired. Government is committed to a 791.2 billion rand in infrastructure investment. We are already partnering with the private sector and other players to roll out infrastructure through initiatives such as the blended finance system. However, all these efforts to expand infrastructure will be wasted if the end user does not pay a cost-reflective tariff for usage. Let me repeat. However, all these efforts to expand infrastructure will be wasted if the end user does not pay a cost-effective tariff for use. Therefore, the principle of the user pays is very important, and I would like to repeat it in this House. The other thing, Honorable President, the other thing is a tendency amongst us, or some amongst us, to destroy infrastructure. We build today, somebody bans tomorrow. We build a police station, they ban it, tomorrow they demonstrate that they need a police station. Doesn't make sense. And therefore, we cannot do this anymore. We have to confront head-on the culture of the destruction of our own infrastructure and introduce a new mentality of asset management. The communities must own these assets and protect and defend them. Madam Speaker, my fourth reason for hope is that this budget explicitly supports economic transformation and job creation. Our 6.2 trillion spending envelope over the medium-term expenditure framework gives expression to the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Program. Now, this, once again, I must say, is not an austerity budget. And I must emphasize this, particularly for those in the democratic movement. This is not an austerity budget. This is not an austerity. An austerity budget, as explained by one honorable member here, would be a situation where we're now closing social grants, we're now closing schools, we are now no longer spending on anything, that we cut old age pension and everything else, like you saw in Greece. That's austerity. This one, icon. Our fastest growing area of spending is our investment in the future capital payments progress. Now, the Minister of the Department of Public Service and Administration, Minister Celso Mchunu, is working with our partners in organized labor to achieve a fair public sector compensation dispensation when negotiations resume on a new multi-year wage settlement later this year. I know there are some who, when they are not aware that conversations are taking place, they say that we are lying when we say conversations are taking place. When you're not aware, it doesn't mean it's not happening. We have cumulatively made 83.2 billion available for the public employment program since the 2020 special adjustment budget. We are now augmenting this by 11 billion rand for the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative, taking the total funding for employment creation to nearly 100 billion. When the president spoke about 100 billion, people said the president was dreaming, but it's a good dream because it's being realized now. The key issue, just proceed and get the wheels going. Government plans to finalize 1,409 restitution claims at a cost of 9.3 billion over the next 3 years to achieve redress and equitable access to land. Within this context, the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development will set aside 896.7 million for post-settlement support. This will include the recruitment of approximately 10,000 experienced extension officers. The reason why I say experienced, so you don't hire somebody immediately from high school as an extension officer, because then they arrive at the Ramaphosa farm to help, but they expect him to teach them. So it can't work like that. You have to know what is farming. So when you go to Minister Mantashe to advise him, don't expect him to advise you how to grow sheep. You should be able to advise him how to make good. So we emphasize the experience in the extension workers. A total MTF allocation of 7 billion is being made available to the Land Bank. This allocation will help to resolve the bank's current default and re-establish the development and transformation mandate. This amount will not affect the expenditure ceiling, but will be offset through other budgetary processes, as will be the case with all other state-owned enterprises. The Department of Small Business Development has allocated 4 billion rand over the medium term to support township and rural enterprises. The Department of Tourism has reprioritized 540 million rand over the medium term to establish the Tourism Equity Fund as one of the measures to support the tourism sector in our country. The fund will acquire equity stakes in existing tourism enterprises, support the expansion of operations and the development of new operations. This is a model that I like. Equity ownership, not just gifts. This I like. I have by now outlined a few of the reasons we have to be hopeful, but also acknowledge that much work remains to be done. And it's part of the work that still needs to be done. Honorable members, an incorrect notion has developed that says that the government is swimming in cash. An incorrect notion has taken hold that government is swimming in cash.
That's ICE, not the government. That's ICE.
Certainly, compared to October last year, we are in a much better situation. But our assessment from the supplementary budget time in June last year still stands. Our public finances are dangerously overstretched. Our borrowing requirement will remain well above 500 billion rand in each year of the medium term, despite the modest improvements in our fiscal position. Consequently, gross loan debt, terrible pronunciation, gross loan debt will increase from 3.95 trillion in the current fiscal year to 5.2 trillion in 2023-24. We owe a lot of people a lot of money. This includes foreign investors in our bond market, pension funds, local and foreign banks, unit trusts, financial corporations, insurance companies, the PIC, and ordinary South African bond holders. Therefore, we must shore up our fiscal position in order to pay back the massive obligations we have incurred over the years. Madam Speaker, I must advise this House that we now expect to collect 1.21 trillion rand in taxes during 2020-21, which is about 213 billion rand less than our 2020 budget expectations. This is the largest tax shortfall on record. In 21-22, government expects to collect 1.37 trillion, provided our underlying assumptions on the performance of the economy and the tax base hold. I would like to take this opportunity to thank those South Africans who diligently continue to pay their taxes, rendering unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. In this budget, we make the following tax proposals. Number one, maybe we should make that number last. Anyway, number one, the corporate income tax rate will be lowered to 27% for companies with years of assessment commencing on or after. Now, this needs to be explained. This will be done alongside a broadening of the corporate income tax base by limiting interest deductions and assessed losses. We'll give consideration to further rate decreases to make our tax system more attractive and competitive. We'll do so in a revenue-neutral manner. We also intend to leverage the insights of the David Davis Tax Committee as we undertake this reform process. I think I'll have to come back to this to explain. Two, the personal income tax brackets will be increased by 5%, which is more than inflation in general. Groenewald. This will provide 2.2 billion rand in tax relief. Most of that relief will reduce the tax burden on the lower and middle income households. As an illustration, if you are earning above the new tax-free threshold of 87,300 Rand, you will have at least an extra 756 Rand in your pocket as of the 1st of March 2021. 3, fuel levies will be increased by 27 cents per litre, comprising 15 cents per litre for the general fuel levy and 11 cents per litre for the road accident fund levy, and 1 cent per litre for the carbon fuel levy. This is important to emphasize because we're moving towards a carbon-free environment, and we've recently established the Presidential Coordinating Committee on Climate Change. Fourthly, an 8% increase in excise duties on alcohol and tobacco products. From today, with immediate effect. With immediate effect. A 340 milliliter can of beer or cider will cost an extra 14 cents. B, a 750 milliliter bottle of wine will cost an extra 26 cents with immediate effect. C, a 750 milliliter bottle of sparkling wine, an extra 86 cents. Next, a bottle of 750 milliliter spirits, including whiskey, gin or vodka, will increase by 5 Rand 50 cents. Next, a packet of 20 cigarettes will be an extra 1 Rand 39 cents. Next, 25 grams of piped tobacco will cost an extra 47 cents. I'm sorry, one retired president, I'm sorry. And a 23-gram cigar will be 7 Rand 71 more expensive. There is no increase in the price of traditional beer. We have to do this partly in honor of some of the more elderly members of the House. In fact, ever since when Trevor Manuel was Minister of Finance, it's one thing which has stayed constant. It is clear that the excessive alcohol consumption in our country can lead to negative social and health outcomes. Consumers do react to price increases, and higher prices should lead to lower consumption of alcohol products with positive spin-offs. SARS has started to deepen its technology, data and machine learning capability. I want to ask, what is machine learning? It is also expanding specialized audit and investigative skills in the tax and customs areas to renew its focus on the abuse of transfer pricing, tax base erosion, and tax crime. In this coming fiscal year, SARS will establish a dedicated unit to improve compliance of individuals with wealth and complex financial arrangements. This first group of taxpayers have already been identified and will receive communication during April 2021. In support of these initiatives, we request that this House approve an additional spending allocation to SARS of 3 billion rand over the medium term. Madam Speaker, let me now turn to the division of revenue. The 2021-22 division of revenue stands as follows. 48.7% of nationally raised funds are allocated to national government, 41.9% to provinces, and 9.4% to local government. This is after providing for debt service costs, the contingency reserve, and provisional allocations that I made mention of earlier. The provincial equitable share will be augmented by 8 billion rand for provincial health departments in 2021-22 to deal with COVID-19. Of the 10.3 billion for vaccines, 2.4 billion is allocated to the provincial departments of health to administer the COVID-19 vaccine program. Government will also put in place a no-fault compensation fund to cover claims in the unlikely event of any severe vaccine injuries, allocations to which will be announced in due course. The local government equitable share is set to increase to 9.7% of the division of revenue in 23-24. We are aware that financial governance remains a challenge for many municipalities. Therefore, the Municipal Systems Improvement Grant is extended for the rollout of the district development model. Madam Speaker, we hereby wish to encourage collaboration and partnerships between municipal councils, labor, communities, and the private sector around the principles of shared risk and shared reward. There needs to be a transition to smart local government and innovation. At the same time, well-functioning municipalities require that residents pay for services rendered. Provinces will receive 3.5 billion from the Department of Social Development to improve access to early childhood development services. 6.3 billion is allocated to extend the special COVID Social Relief of Distress grant until the end of April 2021. Mr. President, we're responding to your injunction. In addition, 678.3 million is earmarked for Provincial Department of Social Development and Basic Education to continue rolling out free sanitary towels for learners from low-income households. Now, the regular social assistance grants are adjusted upwards. The old age disability care dependency grants are increased to 1,890 rand. The increase for war veterans grant to 1,910 rand. An increase in child support grant goes up to 460 rand. An increase for foster care grant increases to 1,050 rand. Government remains committed to ensuring that deserving students are supported through higher education. The National Treasury is working closely with the Department of Higher Education and Training to work out on policy and funding options that will be detailed in the medium-term budget policy statement. What this means is that deserving students who have been admitted to university will be supported. The budget that we table here today, Madam Speaker, takes seriously our commitment to the continent of which we are part. Payments to the Southern African Customs Union, SACU, have been revised upwards by 1.9 billion in 2022 and 15.5 billion in 23-24 to 137.3 billion rand over the medium term. This is very important for some of the countries in Southern Africa, and we must not lose sight of the need to adjust this. The African Renaissance and International Cooperation Fund will, over the medium term, support various projects in Africa, whether it's democracy, economic development, integration, and others. An allocation of 148.1 million rand is therefore set aside for this fund. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, part of which came into effect early this year, presents us with the opportunity to deepen our trade and financial linkages with our continent. Following last year's budget announcement on supporting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement through a more modern risk-based capital management flow system, much progress has been made to implement the new system, and new regulations will be published by the South African Reserve Bank shortly. The National Treasury also continues to work with industry bodies to promote South Africa as a financial hub for Africa. From the 1st of March 2021, companies with a primary listing offshore, including dual listings, will be aligned to current foreign direct investment rules, which the South African Reserve Bank oversees. In order to improve access to African markets, our 6 busiest border posts will be upgraded and expanded. This will significantly improve our infrastructure investments using the PPP model, public-private partnerships. Starting with Beitbridge, which was built in 1929 and was last upgraded in 1995. These one-stop border posts will harmonize the crossing of borders by people and goods, eliminating the dreadful sins that we have witnessed recently. But I need to emphasize the public-private partnership model. Though we face many difficulties, we must not lose sight of our place in the world, as well as our potential and responsibilities. 25 years ago, on the 8th of May 1996, on the occasion of the adoption of the South African Constitution, former President Thabo Mbeki delivered his seminal African address from this podium. President Mbeki reminded us that there are moments in time when we must define what we want to be. And I quote, "Together with the best in the world, we too are prone to pettiness, petulance, selfishness, and short-sightedness. But it seems to have happened that we looked at ourselves and said the time had come that we make a superhuman effort to be other than human, to respond to the call to create for ourselves a glorious future, to remind ourselves of the Latin saying, gloria est consequenda, glory must be sought." Honorable members, our fiscal path requires that we better leverage government status as the largest purchaser of goods and services in the country. Finalization of the procurement bill is therefore urgent. The National Treasury is fast-tracking the process of this bill. This bill addresses fragmentation in the procurement legislation, we aim to table this reform before Cabinet as soon as possible. Many of the tips that I received spoke of the importance of zero-based budgeting. The National Treasury is finalizing the framework to implement zero-based budgeting across the government system. This will be done through spending reviews, which have been used internationally to achieve spending efficiencies. These reviews are already underway and will shape this framework. The Department of Public Enterprises and the National Treasury will be the first to pilot a new budgeting methodology. The intention is to produce significantly recosted budgets from 22-23. The Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, Madam Speaker, is allocated a further 1.8 billion to improve business processes. This allocation will support our brave law enforcement agents in the fight against crime and corruption. We're bringing the long arm of the law into the digital age through the Justice Modernization Program. The South African Revenue Service, South African Reserve Bank, and the Financial Intelligence Center are working jointly on combating criminal and illicit cross-border activities through an interagency working group. This group has completed 117 investigations and found 2.7 billion rand for our fiscus. In other words, they've recovered. Customs and excise operations are reducing the illicit movement of goods across borders, assisted by specialized cargo scanners, resulting in 3,393 seizures valued at 1.5 billion for the fiscal year to January. We announced in the medium-term budget policy statement the historic agreement with all NEDLAC constituencies for the annuitization of provident funds. This will enable all workers to continue to enjoy tax deductions on their contributions. The NEDLAC constituencies also agreed to accelerate the introduction of auto-enrollment for all employed workers and the establishment of a fund to cater for workers currently excluded from pension coverage as an urgent intervention towards a comprehensive social security system. I can announce once again that annuitization for provident funds takes effect from the 1st of March 2021. And provident fund members will continue to enjoy a tax deduction on their contribution. In addition, as we mentioned before, the National Treasury will this week publish draft amendments to the Regulation 28 for public comment. The proposed amendments to Regulation 28, in case somebody misunderstands, is to make it easier for retirement funds to increase their investments in infrastructure. This 2021 budget framework puts South Africa on a course to achieve a primary surplus. By doing this, government debt will stabilize at 88.9% of GDP in 2025. The path is challenging but achievable. It is the most prudent way to achieve higher levels of prosperity and avoid a sovereign debt crisis. Madam Speaker, honorable members, when the Constitution was adopted 25 years ago, the words, quote, "Nothing can stop us now," unquote, resonated in this House. As we affirm our commitment to sustainable public finances, we also at the same time affirm the supremacy of the Constitution, and that all of us, young and old, must abide by the injunctions in the Constitution. Madam Speaker, I would like to thank the President of the Republic of South Africa and the Deputy President for their courageous leadership during these testing times. A word of appreciation to the Deputy Minister of Finance, Dr. David Masondo. Thanks to the Director General of the National Treasury, the hard-working Dondo Mohajan, and his dedicated team at the National Treasury. Many thanks to the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service, who continues to collect revenue and help us, the hard-working Mr. Edward Kiswet. And he's also good-mannered, by the way. My gratitude as well go to the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Mr. Lesetja Kganyago, and the outstanding staff at the South African Reserve Bank for their support. We normally do modeling together, and it's wonderful. I particularly want to appreciate my colleagues in Cabinet and the wisdom of the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, MINCOMBAT. I also thank my colleagues in the Budget Council, which Budget Council is Minister of Finance together with the MECs of Finance. I know there's one of them doesn't like to be called an MEC, but it's fine. I am grateful to the parliamentary committees who also work tirelessly on the budget processing through all this documentation in order to provide Parliament with a report. Finally, to the millions of South Africans who face and continue to face enormous difficulties and challenges, we ask of you to take courage, persevere, and work with us. Above all, let us heed the counsel of Archbishop Desmond Tutu to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. A prosperous future is possible for our beloved country. Gloria est consequent. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.
Welcome back. Well, there you have it, the Finance Minister tabling that national budget speech, which he emphasized that it was not a budget of austerity. But what we can all agree on is that it was a budget that sought to restore confidence in the economy and, of course, in the government's ability to ensure that we do turn around our current economic trajectory. Let me once again remind you that you can be part of this discussion by using the functionality on your screen to send us your questions. And those that we have received so far, we will be answering in just a short while. Let me now reintroduce you to our panel of experts, starting off with Ricardo Smith, who is the head of investment strategy at Absa Global Investment Solutions. We also have Thabi Nkosi, who is a managing partner that's at African Green Alpha Private Equity. Also on our panel is Christoph van der Rieder, who is executive director at Agri SA. We also have Professor Fedi Meyer, who is the managing director at the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. And rounding up is Simon Gia, who is of course a writer, broadcaster, as well as an environmental scientist. Now, Thabi, let me start off with you. Having seen what the minister has come out with, as an international credit ratings agency, is this rather a speech that speaks to your concerns? As we will bear in mind that over the past few years, ratings agencies and investors have had a somewhat negative view of the South African macroeconomic as well as investment environment.
Yeah, thanks, Suki. I thought that the minister said many of the right things. Of course, we have to be cognizant that he has he has to balance a lot of political objectives with what he says in the budget. So I think he did a good job on that front. Of course, what the investors have always, kind of been saying is that the public sector's wage bill is it seems to be ballooning, and it's quite a critical component of the budget deficit that we run. We didn't really hear the minister address that, and I know that ratings agencies have addressed that point quite specifically. So perhaps, as we look through the documents that the National Treasury has put out, we might get some more information on that. And I think this issue of confidence in terms of international investors and ratings agencies is critical at this point. We've heard the minister really talk about a lot of emphasis on public-private partnerships, the creation of funds in the tourism space, at the borders for infrastructure. So that all requires the private sector and particularly global investors or international players to come to the party. It was crucial at this point for the minister to give some comfort to these. And I think he did a good job in light of the very, very difficult environment that we're currently working in.
Thank you so much, Thabi. Ricardo, are you comforted, especially given that the gross debt has now increased from 65.6% to 80.3% of GDP, this for the current fiscal year?
Thanks, Zuki. There's quite a lot of mixed bags in there, so some positives and some negatives. I think the debt to GDP was always expected to deteriorate to around current levels. But what has come out on the positive side, which was also expected looking at some of the December revenue numbers, is an overshoot in the tax revenue collection. And this, in actual fact, has been spent in various ways. One of them, when you look at where in the midterm budget policy statement, government was expecting to stabilize debt at around 95% debt to GDP. They are currently expecting that to stabilize at around 89% debt to GDP, so a slight improvement from the midterm budget policy statement. Although the cost of servicing debt, it's quite important to note that it's still the fastest growing expenditure item at around 13% over the next couple of years. But yet again, a moderate improvement from the midterm budget policy statement, which was seeing debt grow at levels in excess of 15%. Still worse off than last year's national budget, but some improvement from the midterm budget policy statement.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Crossing over to you, Christo. Are you somewhat assured that we are on the right growth path, given what the minister has indicated? Of course, taking into account, or rather being honest, of the challenges that lie ahead for the economy.
I must be honest, we're really scraping the barrel here. We're reaching levels of debt never had before. 5.2 trillion in 2023-2024. A tax shortfall of 213 billion rand. And yes, now we're going for the easy targets. We've seen some taxes increased by 8%, fuel levies increased by 27 cents, and we also see personal income tax increasing by 5%. And unfortunately, it's the soft targets that are now being targeted to put some wine back into the barrel. And for me, that's a very, very big concern. Yes, we certainly welcome the investment in infrastructure to the tune of 791 billion rand. And obviously, we want to see how this play out in practice. There's another 100 billion rand for employment creation. The question is, how is this going to play out in practice? And then the minister has also mentioned the recruitment of 10,000 extension officers to help with post-settlement support and getting new farmers on the go wherever land is being distributed to them. And the proof is in the pudding, but one cannot, lose hope in the midst of everything that's happening out there. But I think there's a big job at hand for government to make sure that this money is well spent.
Indeed. Now, Simon, coming back to you, if I do recall, not much mentioned in terms of the green economy. Now, as we all know that a transition to a green economy has the potential to drive sustainable economic growth. Does South Africa have a green economy strategy at all?
We do, in that there is a very, very clear effort by governments to spend money on wind and solar power. They are in the fifth window of bids at the moment to get additional wind farms on the go, and another bid is set to open in August. That stuff's all very much bedded into the policy. So I wasn't really expecting too much new to come out of this budget in that regard. I think this was probably a budget that was conservative and careful, and that probably is good news from an environmental point of view. That we're looking at thoughtful governance. I was quite heartened by the 1.7 billion for anti-corruption and for sophisticated anti-crime methods, because environmental law is often prosecuted by someone sitting behind a laptop at a desk. It's not helicopters and guns drawn and that sort of thing. So I'm imagining that type of budget allocation probably helps in terms of strengthening the backbone of environmental legal compliance. I hope so anyway. But generally, yeah, you're quite right. In fact, not even really any mention of electricity or increasing our power supply or our power capacity, anything like that. It was very, very quiet.
Which is quite disappointing, given those power blackouts from Eskom and how obviously as a state-owned entity, they continue to be a drain on the fiscus. Let me now move over to Professor Meyer. Professor, now the minister did emphasize that getting our fiscal house in order is the biggest contribution we can make in order to support our economic reconstruction and recovery plan. From the perspective of someone who looks at policy, even if it is policy that refers or relates to the agricultural sector, what do you make of our efforts to bolster or boost the economy?
Yeah, thanks very much, Zuki. I have to be honest. If I look at the number of points that were raised and the focus of the speech, I would say, well done. A good focus on some of the critical areas that we've been all talking about. So obviously the trick is in the implementation of it. So we just from a general perspective, if we think about investment and getting our house in order, what's the overall message? What I talked about just before the speech, in terms of Tabi and your colleagues, you can come in here. What's the overall message that we get across to the world out there? And I think this last statement that he made in terms of the supremacy of the Constitution is important. Talking about this superhuman effort, we know the reality is it's tough, and that's the only thing, that's what we need to get this right. But also South Africa's position within the African Free Trade Agreement, very interesting. our responsibility on the continent, carefully positioning already, seeing the opportunity of being the financial hub for Africa. So there's definitely this language of what can South Africa offer? Obviously, then just a quick side note on Africa Free Trade Agreement for agriculture, absolutely critical. Big trading partner for us. Major issues in Beitbridge, a number of our cross-border ports really not functioning well, a major constraint, just the transportation costs. And then lastly, and I'll leave it at that, your investment in infrastructure is critical. The balance will just be how much of this infrastructure can we really afford, and how much will agriculture and agro-processing get, and we need to be very articulate where are the focus areas. We won't be able to fix everything. I didn't hear anything on water infrastructure, or maybe I missed that. It's a critical one. There are some critical routes that we need to fix. And maybe, sorry, just the last one. On illicit trading, that's a point of major concern. We're raising taxes on tobacco, but we've seen the reports out of this COVID period. Unofficially, if you talk to some of the industry leaders, they are arguing that share of the market's around about 50% now of illicit trade. So we are raising taxes, but those taxes are really not coming in. It's a major illicit trade happening, and I'm grateful. I'm happy that that's being mentioned, and hopefully it can be really made some action on that.
Thank you so much, Professor Meyer, for that. Thabi, let me come back to you. Now, the Minister obviously adjusting our economic growth expectations to about 5.5% in 2021 before moderating rather slightly to 4.2% in 2022. Now, the government is known to be rather optimistic when it comes to how they forecast our growth, that is. What are your thoughts on this? Is this even feasible?
So you're quite right, Zuki. The National Treasury has in the past been accused of being overly optimistic when it comes to their forecast in terms of economic performance. What we heard the Minister say this afternoon is that they expect a slight rebound of about 3.3% in this year. And that's not too far off from what a lot of the investment banks have been targeting. So, we've seen economic growth forecast ranging from about 2.5% to say 3%. So I would say it's a pretty good assessment. And I think that there's a lot of realism in that. I was quite encouraged that the Minister spoke about or alluded to the impact that COVID-19 could possibly have on that growth forecast. And so the Treasury has increased the contingency reserve from 5 to 12 million, meaning that we will be more ready in this current year to deal with any unexpected COVID-19 related challenges than we were in the previous year. And I think those can have a very, very big impact. So I was quite encouraged to see, in addition to reprioritization towards health spending, that allocation towards the contingency reserve really positions us to be able to meet the growth targets that the Treasury has set.
Thank you so much, Thabi. Let's now go through some of the questions that have come through. Just a reminder to you, our audience, to continue to send through those questions using the functionality on your screen. This one comes from Abri, who says, a government needs to use some of the infrastructure budget to maintain the rural infrastructure, that being roads, or rather leading to silos. Not sure if there's anyone on our panel who would like to tackle this one. Maybe Professor Meyer?
Yes, sure. I think that's a critical one. I briefly mentioned it. Let me give you a practical example. We are currently looking, let's just take the soybean integrated value chain with poultry. That's a hot topic. We talk about that a lot. We've just signed off the poultry master plan. Just to be practical, we have invested in over 2 million tons of processing capacity for soybeans. Let's say at an 80% utilization rate, which is on average what these plants can run at. We have a comfortable processing capacity of 1.7, 1.8 million tons. Even if we produce and we have a very good crop coming in, if we look at our meal equivalent of beans that we need locally, we still import about 300,000, 400,000 tons of meal. We are rapidly reducing the amount of imports of meal as the production of soybean is expanding. This year we're expecting a crop. I don't want to make big crop estimates here on this forum, but we would comfortably, I think, BFAP's projections are on about 1.65 million tons. Now that brings us much closer to actually having enough beans locally to crush and actually supply the market. The problem is that about 30% of this meal is being used at our coastal areas. And the transportation from where our crushing plants are on the reef down to the coast is more expensive than bringing in ships from Argentina into the coast. And that's a long story short. To just give you a practical example, we shift about 70 to 80% of our grain and products on road, and that's extremely expensive. So taking a ton from Randfontein, about 700, 800 Rand down to Western Cape. So even though we have this good crushing capacity on the reef, we just can't get it competitively down to Western Cape to do the import replacement, etc., etc., etc. So this just gives a bit of a practical example where we need to have focused programs. So it's wonderful. We need that investment in rural towns and rural silo spaces, but we need to be also smart about it. And I think this is where private sector and government can work together very closely to come up with very tangible and prioritized solutions.
Thank you so much, Professor. Ricardo, let me come over to you. There's a question coming through from the line from Louis, who is rather concerned that we are borrowing money to ensure the well-being of the rest of the continent, when in actual fact, we here at home have struggles of our own. He continues to say that there was no addressing of the increasing of the tax base, just milking the current cow. Your thoughts on that?
For sure. I mean, you look at the case of South Africa, the dependency ratio between those who are able to fund revenue has actually been increasing. So there's quite a bit of strain from a tax-based perspective. What was relieving to see in this budget is that there is a bit of tax relief, the minister echoing the sentiments that there isn't appetite for further taxing a strained base. And in terms of so this is the worry, when you look at the medium-term projections of the fiscal deficit, government is still not expecting it to turn positive, although they are expecting it to narrow. And over the past couple of 10 years, that deficit has been funded by the issuing of more and more debt. And even though we've been projecting a stabilization of debt, it seems when you look at the next 3 to 4 years, we're still expecting the deficit to persist. And, that relationship between expenditure, tax revenue, and economic growth, you really can't run away from it. And I think Tabi mentioned the improvement in economic growth over the short to medium term, which was largely expected from a low base of the contraction of 7% last year. But once you start looking 4 or 5 years further out, you're starting to see that real growth rate fall below levels of 2%, which really speaks to that negative output gap that we spoke about earlier. And so you may worry that further out, you will see this debt continuing to spiral out of control.
Which, of course, Ricardo, is something that international credit ratings agencies always warn us against. Moving on to you, Christo, a question from Melissa van der Merwe. Melissa says, from a value chain perspective, one also wonders what the effect of the 8% will be on glass manufacturers, especially in an environment where we are trying to protect jobs. Of course, yesterday, the numbers coming out that our unemployment rate is at a record high of 32.5%, if I'm not mistaken. Christo, over to you.
Oh, sorry. We've seen quite a spike in unemployment. Unemployment currently sits, according to the expanded definition, at approximately 41%. We have seen massive youth unemployment. And the big question is, to what extent will all of these increase in taxes, the SIM taxes, also other taxes, have a negative impact on various industries? One thing that I want to also mention is that we have experienced quite low interest rates. And maybe that will offset to a certain extent, these increases in taxes. But on the other hand, many of our sectors, like the wine sector as well as the tobacco sector, they're experiencing serious challenges. And the overall alcohol beverage sector, for a couple of months, they haven't been in business. And one would have, thought that the minister would be sympathetic to their cause and find ways and means to bring them into production. The same with the tourism sector as well. Another big concern for me is the balance within the budget. If you just look at social services, they get the bulk, 1.2 trillion rand. If you look at what is being allocated towards economic development, and within that frame of economic development sits economic infrastructure, industrialization, innovation, and science, a mere 207 billion rand for real economic, hardcore economic enablers. Agriculture sits at 27.4 billion rand. And the big question is, where is our priorities? We tend to allocate money, obviously for social services, and that's critical. But on the other hand, we need to ask ourselves whether we continue to, the emphasis is so much on welfare as opposed to wealth creation. And that is the big battle that I have in terms of the overall budget. We need to invest more money into wealth creation.
Thank you so much, Christo, for that. Tabi, let me come back to you and try and kind of get to the bottom of that tripartite alliance between the government, Labour, as well as the SACP. Now, of course, every time the government makes any pronouncements regarding the adjustments to the public sector wage bill, it always sort of gets a bit of pushback from its Labour partners. How do you foresee the government succeeding in this regard when the state, not the state, but the government of the ANC being in relationship with Labour?
Yeah, so I mean, Minister Mboweni has in every budget speech since becoming the minister spoken about the public sector wage bill issue. And it was quite surprising that he didn't bring it up in this address. I was expecting it. Of course, he has in the past cautioned us that our wage bill is ballooning. Almost half of our national revenue goes towards wages. So it really is something that needs to be addressed. And after the statement that the minister made in October last year, we saw the labor unions really up in arms around, how can we balance the need to create more jobs while at the same time making continuous statements about having to cut public sector employment. So I still think that the minister is under a lot of pressure in that respect. We certainly have to continue talking about this. It can't be swept under the rug. And I think that this is a very sore political point, especially, given what has been happening in the political arena. So I think the minister is giving himself some breathing room, but it is an issue that he will have to come back to.
Simon, let me also bring you in. Now, not much stated in terms of the carbon tax, but the minister did mention that a few levies will be increased by 27 cents per litre, as well as 11 cents per litre for the road accident fund. And there's also an 8% increase in the excise duties on alcohol and tobacco, as touched on by the various panelists, as well as a 1 cent per litre for the carbon fuel levy. What do you make of these announcements?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on this also in response to what Christo was saying earlier, that we've got all of these various sin taxes that are portrayed as a means of trying to get a social benefit as well as raise income. But it's very, very clear to me that they are really more about the increased tax revenue than they are about changing behavior. And the carbon tax or the carbon levy on the fuel price is a very, very good example. 1 cent per litre, that is not enough to change behavior at all. So that is purely they're using the carbon levy as a reason to put an additional 1 cent per litre onto your petrol levy. And we know that the principle is that you can't ring fence that money, so it doesn't get guaranteed to be allocated towards green projects or anything like that. We had this problem with the plastic bag levy as well. And I would really, really like to see the government stop this this overemphasis on the sin taxes every single year. I mean, we see it every time. It obviously plays well with the electorate, and that's why they spent a crazy amount of time really drilling down into how much it was going to cost per can of beer or whatever. And I would far rather see them proudly say, okay, well, this is how much alcohol costs our economy through, you know, social ills and so on. This is how we're going to try and solve that, rather than trying to dress up a tax as some sort of social initiative. And while I've been obviously talking about the sin taxes in this regard, carbon taxes very, very much fall into that that general basket as well.
Christo, let me come back to you. A concern coming through from Pete Fisser, who says that the agricultural sector is going to be hard hit with the increase in fuel prices that Simon was touching on now, combined with the increase of 16% in minimum wages, as well as the increase of 15% in electricity. The wine industry in particular, with a lower income, will struggle. The roads in rural areas are rather in dire need of repairs. Government has too many people relying on grants, which leads to the death of a goose laying that golden egg. What do you make of that, Christo?
Indeed, it is very clear to us that as more and more people are becoming dependent on grants, government will struggle to find the money to satisfy the needs of all these unemployed people. Just to give an example, I've seen the stats from the social agency. They are now forking out 8.4 million grants to approximately 11.1 million people. Government has promised that they will continue with this 350 Rand payment for the next 3 months, and also TERS benefits for another 3 months. The big question is what will happen after that, because now we've created expectation, and that can lead to serious challenges. But on the other hand, government doesn't make it easier for business to invest, to create more jobs, and to do what they do best, and that is to run businesses. With all of these factors, such as increase in wages, increase in taxes, increase in fuel levies, also with a rand that causing a lot of challenges on the input side of the sector, farmers are going to continuously find themselves in a credit crunch. And my big question is, and that not only applies to the agricultural sector, it also applies to many other sectors. And our appeal to government is to free up the economy, do away with all of these constraints, legislative constraints. Just for a farmer to apply, for example, for exemption, he or she has to go through such a bureaucratic process that people will just decide to help with it. We're not going to do it anymore. We're going underground, and that is not what you want to. That is not what we want to happen in this country. So yes, we've got a bit of a problem going ahead.
Thank you so much, Christo. Ricardo, coming back to you now as an investment strategist. Every now and then you have to look at your how you're allocating to various portfolios. Having heard what the minister has come out and said, and some of the concerns that Christo has just raised in relation to investments, are you going to be making any adjustments, or how are you moving with what you know today? Ricardo?
Hi, sorry about that.
Yes.
For sure. So I still haven't looked at some of the market reactions, but I certainly would expect that bond yields would somewhat moderately compress, given that debt to GDP ratio is expected to stabilize at a lower level than at the medium-term budget policy statement. However, the extent to which government is actually able to constrain their budget and stick to those targets will remain to be seen. Of course, our bond yields are quite attractive from a valuation perspective, having priced in quite a lot of credit default in them. So, from an investment strategy perspective, still getting quite a lot of real return in government bonds. Still concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the economy. Even though we are seeing that improvement from the low base last year, there are some structural issues which have been touched upon by quite a lot of the panelists today, which have included struggling businesses, high levels of unemployment, low levels of consumer spending propensities, business liquidations, and the likes. And so from a valuation perspective, you look at local listed equities, you do worry about equities going ahead of themselves and pricing in a much faster recovery in the COVID-19 pandemic than what we're actually experiencing, as we're almost done the first quarter, but we've still experienced quite a lot of lockdowns. So that vaccine rollout program will be quite significant going forward, and how effectively government is able to do that. And over the long term, how effectively government is able to stick to what they said they will do here today. And that will be seen at the next midterm budget policy statement.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Professor Meyer, back to you. Earlier, we spoke about how there needs to be consistency in what we say we're going to do and what we actually end up doing. Of course, this being as a reflection of how the government always has great policies, but in terms of implementation, we always come up short. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's difficult to say this time's going to be different. And that's a challenge. Maybe let's kind of get this back to the discussion that are around the master plans, the design around the master plans, the idea of master plans, and having these open dialogues, the opportunity where actually social partners, it's designed to be co-created by social partners. In other words, your business, your labor, and a government are actually sitting around a table and really focusing on what needs to be done, who's going to do it, and how, and who's going to provide the budget for it. So that there's no other way of actually moving this into action in those spaces around PPPs and the encounter responsibilities. And that's what our minister has also referred to a number of times as the responsibility. They were referring also to the equity ownership. So there were a number of points, if I just quickly look at my notes, also in terms of cross-border border crossings, etc. So what we really need is actually this business-like execution, focus, and efficiency in government to actually execute. And we've seen that in a number of spaces. If we just think again back to agriculture, the reality is, yes, costs are rising, and agriculture and agro-processing could absorb those costs in an environment where they actually have growth and opportunity for growth, and the ability to invest. So, and this brings us back to policies that create uncertainty. And a good example of that is your land reform policies, which are uncertain. So the only way that you can drive efficiency, absorb more labor, or invest in labor is if you invest. And you won't invest if your environment is not certain and solid to do it. So, I'm not sure if I can get a real model out of this speech where we say, colleagues, this is how we're actually going to move into action. They've referred to house and order, and we've seen a number of these models, but that's really the challenge now and I think this counter responsibility and doing things together, creating platforms where we can work together, keep one another in check, making sure this is the focus, we are aligned, this is our target, and let's move together on it. It's probably the best way of doing it. And a practical example, I would really hope that these 10,000 extension officers are not just deployed randomly. There are such wonderful programs out there where they can work very closely together with producer organizations, for example, and they can align with industry stakeholders or value chain players who are also investing in training and also have their own extension officers working in the field. Let's work together with those 10,000 and not just deploy them. Again, that's just a practical example where we can really make sure that where we are investing, we're actually getting the biggest bang for our buck.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Mayam. Tabby, let me pose this one to you, coming through from a line where there is a question where it is asked about, or rather the question focusing on the lowering of the corporate income tax. The question asking whether or not the lower CIT rate will be enough to offset any adverse effects of these limited deductions, and can we broaden that tax base by lowering the CIT while taking away some from somewhere else? I'm not sure if that makes sense to you, Tabby, or you'd want me to ask it again.
Let me give it my best shot, Zuki. So, it was encouraging to see that there is some thinking around the corporate tax rate. It's been a long time since we've seen a change of this nature. And of course, it is a very slight lowering, and it does come with a lot of provisos that we'll still need to interrogate when SARS eventually puts out, what their thinking is in this respect. But I think that the issue that economists and investors have always been making is that we need to make sure that we have an attractive investment climate. And tax is just one of those things that can be a sweetener for investors that are looking at South Africa as a possible destination. So it's encouraging. And the minister did open the door for further reviews of the corporate tax rate from what I read in the speech. So I do think that this is something that we are going to see a lot more of. Whether this can offset the kind of tax increases that we've seen in the speech, that remains to be seen. I doubt that it will, but I think this is almost Treasury trying to show that we are thinking about this issue of having to make this an investment attraction. We are thinking about the fact that there are many different countries where people can invest, where people can go, and we are trying to get you to come to South Africa.
Thank you so much, Tabby, for your insights. And now, as we try and wrap up this discussion, I'm going to ask for the final round what your overall assessments are on the budget, and obviously going forward, the implications that it's likely to have not only on the general economy, but of course on the finances of each and every one of us in the country. Starting off with you, Simon, overall, what's your takeaway from today's speech?
I totally get that this is a crisis budget, that we live in uncertain times and all of those cliches. I think my call to government is don't fall into the trap of looking for short-term solutions. Don't cut corners on environmental legislation. Don't put development where it shouldn't be. Don't allow environmental damage in the service of short-term economic gains, because we will pay for those down the line.
Thank you, Simon. Christo, there, Simon saying the government should avoid short-term solutions, basically avoid taking corners. And for you, what's your takeaway?
Indeed, but the bigger issue for me is the ideological alignment within government. You can, especially starts with the president of the country. He, in his own speech, has highlighted his ambitions. And we've seen how the Minister of Finance taking that further. And we hope that the various departments will also align themselves with the ideological position of government. Because on the one hand, you cannot talk about public-private partnerships and talk about how you're going to make it easier for business to operate in South Africa and for investment inflows into the country. How are you going to make it easier for that as well? But on the other hand, you have policy uncertainty. You've got all other types of constraints that impact on that negatively. What I'm trying to say is there needs to be an overall of the entire process within government to ensure that there's alignment, and when people invest, people operate in this country, they know that they have certainty in terms of the long-term objectives that they strive for.
Ricardo, of course, just to echo what Christo just said, certainty being a very key driver of investments. For you, taking into account everything that we've heard, and just last question from Pete Visser, where he says, listening to what you've had to say today, he is concerned about the country's debt position. Just to round off, I'm sure this is something that also concerns you.
For sure, it certainly does. I think, pre-COVID, there were certain levels of debt that we used to be afraid of as a country. And COVID happened, and it kind of gave us a license to accept that our debt to GDP will slip by 20 percentage points. Government should go back and remember that there are reasons we wanted to stabilize debt at levels below 60% debt to GDP. There are real reasons why, in as much as COVID is a real issue that we need to combat, we can't throw away fiscal responsibility and throw the purse away. And you look at the allocation to the vaccine procurement and rollout, it's actually only 10 billion rands, and in the scope of the budget, it's actually not a lot of money. So my question around government would be, a lot of these other initiatives that government comes up with to combat some of the impacts of COVID, they should be done on a very conservative basis. And once money is allocated, it should go to the right places, limit fiscal leakages, and focus on the vaccine and rollout program, whilst also being tough with respect to some of the other issues like wage bill, some state-owned enterprises, so that we can get to a point where we actually stabilize our debt. Because in as much as COVID is real, the spiraling of our debt is also a very real concern from my perspective.
Thank you, Ricardo. Tabi, now coming or rather crossing to you. As we know that the Land Bank, as well as the Post Office, as well as what Ricardo just mentioned in the form of the vaccination program and the funding thereof, these are new things that we were not aware of when the minister spoke to us this time last year. Taking a look at what has been said today and the pronouncements that have been made, that 7 billion rand that has now been allocated to the Land Bank, how do you summarize where we stand?
So I must say that statement regarding the allocation to the Land Bank was one of the highlights for me in the speech. The minister had previously spoken about it last year, and it was very encouraging to see it coming up again. Of course, I had expected that there might be some more detail, but the fact that he emphasized it again in the speech shows that he's committed to this. That for me speaks to government's prioritization of the agricultural sector, and I think it comes through in a number of different places in the budget speech. So, from making sure that we have more effective restitution processes, to post-settlement support, to the provision of additional extension officers, I think agriculture got a fair amount of attention in this budget speech, and that's very, very encouraging. Of course, what we expect is that the next step needs to be, how do we spend that Land Bank 7 billion rands? Is it going to come through in this year? Will there be any conditions? Is the Land Bank's mandate now going to pivot more towards development? And if so, what happens to commercial farmers? So there are a lot of questions to be answered, but I was very encouraged by the fact that agriculture featured so prominently, and it really speaks to the priority that the government gives to the sector.
Yes, indeed. Professor Meyer, you also did sound somewhat positive initially when we started this particular discussion. Do you echo some of the sentiments from Tabi, especially given that you come from an environment, rather a background of food security as well as policy certainty for the agricultural sector?
Yes, certainly. I think, as I mentioned before, the focus areas are good. I think those are the ones that we've been talking about. Maybe just to conclude, I would almost like to mention, refer this to as the hidden treasure in South Africa that we really need to emphasize, is the strength of our institutions in agriculture and agro-processing. And only once you start working in other countries and you start to try to put these value chains together, and you realize how expensive things are and how run down or limited infrastructure is, you actually realize how important it is to maintain this, what we have, and goodness, to grow. We have such opportunities that we're missing. We have idle resources, and the minister did refer to the transfer of state land. Let's focus on the idle resources. Let's focus on the growth areas, which are very specifically outlined by very strong institutions that are in the value chain, that can drive our efficiency, so that we don't come to the situation where we can only increase costs, increase fuel levies, wages, and we don't talk about the growth opportunities and really get those all hooked up and moving forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Meyer. Just to summarize, Simon Gea coming through saying that the government needs to be in a position where it takes the hard decisions and not necessarily cutting corners, and Christo coming there saying that alignment will be very important going forward to make sure that whatever the minister made pronouncements on today does actually deliver. Ricardo, still very concerned about the debt position that we find ourselves in, and emphasizing that debt stabilization will be key going forward. And of course, Thabi, they're sounding very positive, especially in as far as how the minister prioritized the agricultural sector. Well, there you have it. Our time with you has come to an end. Thank you so much for all the questions that you have sent through. Those we were not able to get to, we will try our best to ensure that those are answered and send back the responses to you. As we wrap up, let me thank all of our panelists. As mentioned, Ricardo Smith, investment strategist at Absa Global Investment Solutions, Thabi Ngozi, who is a managing partner at African Green Alpha Private Equity. Sorry about that, Thabi. We also have a Professor Ferdi Meyer, who is the managing executive of the Bureau of Food and Agricultural Policy, as well as Christo van der Riede, who is the managing executive of Agri SA, rounding up with Simon Gea, who is a broadcaster as well as a writer and an environmental scientist. And this is the end of our time with you. From me and the team, thank you.